Hello and welcome to this video where we are going to go over the Retell lecture part of the speaking section. So this is part 2 in this video series, so make sure you watch part 1 if you haven't watched it already. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the template that we're going to use for the Retell lecture. I'm going to go over some solved examples so you see how I can take notes and how I use the template in association with the notes to get really good results in the exam. Again, this is a super easy part of the exam once you get the template and the strategy nailed down. So let's go over the template quickly. So this is the template. It's broken down into three parts: the introduction, main body, and conclusion. In the introduction, the first sentence is the given lecture was a stimulating talk on the topic of blank. Now, if it's a conversation between two people, you can also say the given lecture was a stimulating talk between two individuals on the topic of blank, or if you want to keep it simple, you can just remove the black bracket altogether. So the given lecture was a stimulating talk on the topic of blank, usually based on what your notes that you've taken. The main body, the lecture talked in considerable detail about blank. Another clearly important point covered in this conversation was blank. Now, this third part of the main body, you can use it as an optional in case you don't have that much content that you've covered here. So it was clearly identified that blank. And in the conclusion, you can say as a concluding remark, it can be firmly established that blank. Okay, now obviously we want to fill in those blanks that I've said with notes, and like I mentioned in the previous lecture, you want to have notes that are longer than say 4 words long. And so let's get into it. Let me show you an example of how I would do it. I would do it in the exam. So I'm going to be taking down notes. I'm going to play some sample recordings. I'm going to be taking down notes so you can observe how I take notes in the exam. And then after I've done taking notes, how do I use the template, which is up here on the top corner, in association with the notes that I've taken to come up with a good answer. Hopefully it comes up to be a good answer. Let's see. Anything else that I want to say? Yeah, obviously in the exam now you're going to have an erasable notepad and a marker for you to write down your notes. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to do it on screen so you can see exactly how I do it. But my typing speed and my writing speed is roughly the same. So it should be a fair comparison. Okay, let's get into this. Let me play the lecture and let's get started.
The purpose of a lecture is probably to stimulate students in going to do work by themselves. The end result of a course must be to try and make a student autonomous so that they are happy in finding things out for themselves and not being given things that they'll accept uncritically. So learners need to know that that's the aim, the probable aim of their course of academic study, that they'll be able to be individual learners and independent learners. So a lecture will aim to present perhaps just part of a topic and stimulate the student to want to find out more. And there may be a very good reason to do that if perhaps they've got to do a written assignment on that topic. So that's another reason for paying attention. But paying attention can only happen if you know what to pay attention to. One can't pay attention to everything all at the
The given lecture was a stimulating talk on the topic of the purpose of the lecture and how it is to stimulate students to do work by themselves. The lecture talked in considerable detail about the end result for students is for them to be individual and independent learners. Another clearly important point covered in this conversation was that the lecture will present part of the topic and then stimulate the learners to find out more. In conclusion, it can be firmly established that one can pay attention to everything. One has to pay attention to the key points. Okay. So that was my answer. It was really good in terms of me not having pauses and me taking good notes. So the note taking, I'll just kind of walk you through what I was doing. So as I was taking notes, you might have noticed that first of all, the notes that I've taken is very clear. I can read out of it without having to think. So I just take the template, plug it in with what I've written. It's like a complete sentence. I don't have to like restructure or rephrase anything, because what happens is when you have notes that you need to kind of restructure and reorganize to form a meaningful sentence, you're going to have pauses and you're going to get stuck, and then that's going to eat into your score. So I've taken the time to write down really kind of good long notes, which are almost sentences that I can read. Okay. And you might have noticed is that when I was writing down this note, the lecture like moved completely to another topic. He spoke about one point, he spoke about the other point, but I was still writing the note for that one point because I listened to it really well and I wanted to ensure that I captured correctly, so that when the time came to speak, I was very clear. So the better you are at writing notes, the better that investment is going to pay off when the time has come to speak. Because believe me, if you have notes that are not coherent, and you'll find this as you're practicing as well, when you have notes that are not clear, you're going to struggle. um yes, so that's it. I really like 3 good notes is all you need. This last point, I remember that instead of can't, I said can again because the note wasn't clear. That's what I said, but not a big deal from a content perspective because I still had key points covered. Cool. So that is it for this lecture. Let's move on to another lecture to see how we do in that one. So we get another example to see how to perform this part of the exam. Okay. Let me clear this up. Okay, let's get started.
Every day, we experience the world using our senses. We touch and see and hear and taste and smell, and all that information is sent along nerves to the big lump of gray matter in our heads that we call a brain. But why does any of this matter in the first place? Life as we know it is nothing more than our brain's chemical and electrical interpretation of the signals it receives. Your eyes respond to light, your ears to sound waves, your nose to chemicals in the air, but your brain only responds to a converted electrical signal that it receives from your senses. Allow us to start with a quick overview. The only way for sensations from the outside world to reach your brain is via cells called neurons. Neurons conduct an electrical signal along a long projection to a junction or synapse with another neuron. The electrical signal is known as an action potential, and the long projection along which the signal travels is known as the axon. All information from our senses is accumulated by sensory receptors, which are part of a group of nerves collectively called the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system includes all the nerves but our brain and spinal cord, which form what's called the central nervous system. Sensory nerves send the information you sensed to the spinal cord and brain, where it is processed. Once the central nervous system has processed the information, a response gets sent back out along motor nerves, another part of the peripheral nervous system.
Okay. The given lecture was a stimulating talk on the topic of everyday experience that we have using our senses. The lecture talked in considerable detail about all information is sent along our nerves to our brains. Another important point covered in the conversation was that our eyes respond to light and that the brain only responds to converted electrical senses it receives via neurons. It was clearly identified that all information from our senses is accumulated by sensory receptors. As a concluding remark, it can be firmly established that sensory nerve sends information to the spinal cord and brain where it is processed. Okay, so that was my answer. Fairly good. There was like a hesitation where I actually hesitated on the template, which should ideally not happen. But apart from that, there was not too many hesitations and pauses, and I was able to read these last 3 sentences really carefully. Some points to note was that there was like a part here where even though it did not make sense grammatically, I still spoke fluently, so that's fine. So 1 or 2 grammar mistakes and 1 or 2 kind of hesitations will not kill you, but if it's more than 2, that's when it starts eating into your answer. So keep in mind that it's very difficult for you to have answers where you're going to get everything correct, but try to keep those mistakes to like a minimum of 1 or 2. This was a particularly difficult lecture because the person that was speaking at a really quick rate of speech, and it was hard for me to keep up. But again, I had to remind myself that okay, it's fine that the person is speaking ahead. I just need to listen to like one sentence or two sentences and make sure I capture that in entirety. Yeah, so that's what you want to do. Make sure you capture some certain phrases to make sure that it is usable in when your time comes to kind of read through it. And this was like a really good sentence that I took, and I could just read it in association with the template. So I read, uh, completed the template, and then I added on to it because it was a complete sentence. I could just use it by itself without a template as well. So if you have a really long sentence, you can even use it without the template. And if you have a something that's smaller, like it does well with the template as well. So I hope that gave you a good sense of what you should be aiming for. Again, not perfect answers that you need to get all the time, but as long as you're hitting the main points from a scoring perspective, you're not having hesitations, you're not having pauses, you're speaking fluently, you're covering something related to the topic, you're going to get a 90 score in the exam if you follow the strategy well. Some key points from an exam perspective that you need to remember is, do not you write notes that are not, like, you cannot read and understand. Do not write single words. Make sure it's at least two or three, more than three, ideally four words or longer. And yeah, if there's some, if don't be too afraid if there are parts of the lecture that are where the lecturer has moved forward and you're missing out on content, it's still fine as long as you get two or three or maybe four important points in your answer. That will be more than enough content for you to cover during your lecture. And even if you maybe are not able to capture that, but say for example I did not have this, I can just end with a concluding remark that's based on most of the keywords that I had in the lecture. So I could say, as a concluding remark, it can be firmly established that the brain and nerves are important parts of our body, or anything general that includes maybe one or two keywords related to the lecture. So yeah, I hope this video helped, and I hope you're going to practice this. Make sure that you have the template by heart. You do it a few times, and after a few times you'll notice that this is actually one of the most easiest part of the speaking section, even though initially many people struggle with it. So that's it for this lecture. I'll see you guys in the next lecture.